What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today with a video that's going to be more of a test of my powers of endurance as opposed to a test of my analytical skills, because I'm going to be counting down and ranking every single feature film ever directed by Sir Ridley Scott. And you might be asking, why would you want to subject yourself to that? Even if you spend just like a minute per movie, it's going to be a pretty long video, but I'm determined to do so because I'm going to be home celebrating Thanksgiving when his new movie, Napoleon, gets released, not this coming week, but the following week. And that is going to be his 28th feature film. And let's just pause for a second and appreciate, what does it take to remain at a very high level in the entertainment industry for many, many decades? He was active in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts, the teens, and now the 20s. And what's crazy is when you look at his career overall, he's made more movies in the 21st century than he did in the 20th century when he was establishing his reputation. He's incredibly prolific. I'm not going to tell you that all 28 of these movies are equal, but I think for many years to come, people will continue to discover, enjoy, discuss, and just wrestle with his overall filmography and what are the best films that he's brought to the table. But what's interesting is how I've always considered myself a Ridley Scott fan, going back to the 90s when I first really got bitten by the movie bug. But prior to getting prepared for this video, I'd only seen half of his feature films because he's been so goddamn prolific. You know, I'd skip one here, skip one there. There've been a few periods where I had little cold streaks where I'd skip a couple in a row, and then there'd be a movie that would bring me back and I would fall in love with those movies again. And it's amazing just how steadily he's been able to work throughout this time. He's had a couple little periods here and there where he had rough patches where he was unable to get a project off the ground. Probably the biggest rough patch was from 1992 to 1996, the break between 1492 and White Squall. But like I said before, in the 21st century, he's been incredibly prolific. And there's a case to be made that Ridley Scott might have directed more movies that are just pretty good than anyone else alive. And I don't mean that to be some sort of like, kind of sneaky bit of criticism or an insult or anything like that. But he's just cranked out so many movies that are very watchable, very entertaining, maybe a little forgettable. But once again, if you're able to contribute 2, 3, 4, 5 movies to just the art form of cinema that people regard as some of their favorite movies, I feel like he's earned his place in the history books. I mean, he's been friggin' knighted by the Queen of England, but what's incredible to me is that at his advanced age, I mean, he's well into his 80s now. He was born, I think, in 1936. Just double checking real quick. IMDb is deciding to hide the information from me in a hard to find spot. Sorry, 1937, November 30th, 1937. So he is coming up on, holy crap, he's going to be what? Let me do some quick mental math. He's going to be 86 in a couple weeks. I mean, that's incredible. But what blows my mind is that he has decided that he wants to just continue working. He wants to make movies. And it's not like he's even necessarily making like the movies that he has to be completely, totally invested in. And I would love to hear from him why he feels compelled and so driven to continue making movies at this point when he's basically said all that he has to say. Maybe it's a situation where his crew, and he's very loyal to his crew, and he reuses DPs and assistant directors and composers and editors. Maybe he just likes giving them all jobs to do, or maybe just one of those guys where he feels an incredible sense of purpose when he's on the set. And I've had the privilege of watching him direct firsthand. One of my first jobs out of college was working as basically a driver, but I was called an assistant for producer Branko Lustig on Hannibal back in 2000. And because I was working for one of the producers of the film, I would bump into Ridley on a pretty regular basis. And I was always trying to repress the urge to just fall down on my knees and worship him like a god for having directed Blade Runner. But one of the most interesting parts of watching him in action was watching him in the morning, and periodically he would hop in the car with Branko just to talk about what they were shooting that day. But seeing Ridley creating his Ridleygrams on the way to the set. And if you've never heard of his Ridleygrams, Ridley's a master at drawing very, very quickly. And he would basically create a shot list of what he wanted to accomplish that day. And the first thing he would do when he got to set, he'd hand it off to Terry Needham, his first assistant director, and then Ridley would go off and have an espresso, or smoke a cigar, whatever the case might be, while his DP and his crew would get the first shot prepared. But periodically, I would kind of like sneak a peek over his shoulder just to see what he was working on. And the art, I wouldn't say it's like comic book level, but it was good art. I mean, a lot of his Ridleygrams are available online, and I highly recommend people hunt them down. But if you want to see how you compose a shot and suggest what the camera movements might be and basically storyboard the movie then and there just to kind of get in like the proper headspace before you start shooting, I just found it fascinating to watch him in action. And there were a few very brief moments where I got to interact with Ridley personally. One time I was driving him to the airport during I think a 3-day weekend when we were shooting in DC, and I succeeded in boring him to sleep. I think he was, in my defense, he was tired from the shoot, but as I was talking and ranting and raving, he suddenly started snoring like mid-sentence. I was like, whew, all right. I'm really keeping this guy interested in what I have to say. And there was another time where I told a stupid joke to my boss, Branko. He asked if I knew where I was going, and I said something, basically I was implied that I was driving in the precise opposite direction, and Ridley, who was chomping on a cigar, looked over at me and said, "Do you know what it feels like to have your neck snapped?" And I was like, I'm just kidding. Like, the location's right over yonder hill, blah, blah, blah. But he's got a very dry, low-key sense of humor. But everybody loved and adored him. Everybody called him a bunch of British crew. They referred to him as the governor. And it's weird when you're working with a British crew because the department head in every department is referred to as the governor. So I would come to set with a bunch of coffees, and someone would be like, "Oh, which one's for the governor?" It's like, can y'all just use people's actual names? Because we Americans have no idea who is the governor of your particular department. But getting back to this list, a really weird thing happened while I was getting prepared for this video, because I was watching movies from the 80s, 90s, the aughts, the teens, and now the 20s. And it was almost like I was seeing an alternative history. Like, what if I'd watched those 14 movies instead of the 13 or 14 that I'd already seen? And it was just a weird thing where I was kind of revisiting all these decades I was very familiar with, but seeing all those decades with very fresh eyes. And there were only a few movies that managed to creep pretty high up in the list. I think I'd done a pretty good job of identifying which were the good ones, but there are a few surprises on here that are ranked pretty highly. Of all my fresh discoveries, the one that got ranked the highest would be Kingdom of Heaven, the director's cut roadshow version, but we'll get to that in a sec. But speaking of Kingdom of Heaven, I think there's a chance that Ridley Scott might have directed more historical epics than any other director that is alive today. And I'm saying that just off the top of my head. I mean, maybe Steven Spielberg's directed more quote-unquote historical epics, but Ridley directed 1492. He did Robin Hood. I mean, Robin Hood's less a historical epic and more of like an adventure movie, but it still deals with history, especially his take. We have Exodus, we have Gladiator, we have The Last Duel, we have Kingdom of Heaven, and now Napoleon. That's a hell of a lot of historical epics. And do we include Black Hawk Down on the list? How old does the history have to be an historical epic versus just like a war movie? Because when Black Hawk Down came out, it was dealing with fairly current events. I guess maybe it was the events were 9 or 10 years old at that point. But I feel like there's so many different forms of filmmaking that have kind of died over the last couple of decades. Like the musical is not what it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. The Western is not what it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. We see a lot of superhero movies, less so as they start to fail. But it's cool seeing how Ridley's kind of one of the last giants from a bygone era where people would make blockbuster historical epics. And Gladiator, that was a monster hit and ranks very highly on my list. And now that the SAG strike is over, he can get back to work making Gladiator 2. I mean, he'll be almost 90 years old by the time that movie comes out, but I'll be rooting for him every step of the way. And what was great about when Gladiator came out in 2000, that's when we were shooting Hannibal in Virginia and North Carolina and Washington, D.C. And it was just so cool, having this movie that was a monster hit in the theaters at that time, and just being able to interact with most of the crew members who had been responsible for making it. Even guys like Adam Somner, the second assistant director, they're all telling all these tales from the trenches from the making of that movie. And so at that time, for a young film nerd with considerably more hair, it was just a very, very exciting work experience. And let me just pause for a second and share a few words about the great Branko Lustig, who sadly pushed on a couple of years ago, but it was one of the great working experiences of my life working for him and just watching him in action and just trying not to talk unless I absolutely had to and just listen and learn and observe. And he was a real producer. And I remember him explaining to me that he started out as a location manager and then got promoted to assistant director and then producer because people quickly realized he was the smartest man on the movie. But he started off in Europe making movies with people like Volker Schlondorf. He even has a cameo in the Ten Drum as the not the carnival barker, but the ringmaster in that performance. But he also was one of the producers on Schindler's List. And I'll never forget going to visit the Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and somebody asking if he had any relatives that were connected with the Holocaust, and Branko just rolling up his sleeve and pointing to the numbers tattooed on his forearm, and I was like, oh my fucking God. And every once in a while, he'd share little stories about Auschwitz, where he was rescued as a teenager. And he would talk, like at one point, he was eating an apple on the set and there was nothing left, like this, even only the stem was left. And his real assistant said like, Branko, did you just eat that whole apple? And he looked at her and said, concentration camp. And then he moved on, but he had this very kind of brusque way of speaking. And I remember going to visit, I guess, the construction department when they were building a set over the weekend in case we needed a cover set in the event of bad weather. And I said, Branko, does it bother you, or are you worried that like they're alarmed or annoyed by your presence, kind of checking in on them over the weekend? And he looked at me and said, I give a shit. And anyway, the reason I'm imitating him in this fashion, he's from Croatia. He had a very thick accent, but he was just fucking brilliant. And he just had a heart of joy, and he just loved making movies, and he loved working with Ridley Scott. And it was such an honor and a pleasure and a privilege working with him. And the dude, he just made me laugh all day, every day working with him. So Hannibal was a great experience no matter what, but it was an even better experience due to working alongside Branko Lustig. So let's start getting down to business. I did not revisit every single movie on this list. I saw a ton of movies that I'd never seen before, and I revisited a few that I hadn't seen in a while. Like I revisited Black Rain, I revisited Thelma Louise, I revisited Gladiator. But memories can be incredibly unreliable, and oftentimes if I'm putting together a list or if I'm ranking something, sometimes what can kind of, I guess, shape the list or influence the list is the degree to which I want to watch something again, or the degree to which I'm looking forward to seeing something again. But, memory is a tricky thing, and, it's hard to make a strong, compelling argument as to why a movie is ranked number 15 on your list versus number 16. Like, basically everything from, 27 up through, 12 or 11, you could almost kind of, actually, I shouldn't say you can almost kind of arrange them in any order, because there are a couple of turkeys in here that definitely deserve to be at the worst part of the list. But a lot of these flicks, it's hard to decide, is it number 21 or is it 20? And so, if you ask me this question, a couple of days from now, I might rank all these movies in a totally different order. But one thing you won't see on this list are all of his episodes of television. He's made a lot of shows like Raised by Wolves, or he'll come in and direct the premiere, and then someone else will take over. And a lot of those episodes of TV are pretty goddamn good. You watch them whoa, all right. I can tell Ridley Scott shot this, because Ridley Scott, I wouldn't say he has a signature style, but he definitely has a recognizable style at times in terms of his lighting and his shot composition. There's both he and his brother Tony Scott just know how to shoot the shit out of just about anything. It's because they probably directed more commercials than any two human beings who ever lived. I mean, Ridley Scott, if you look at some of those Chanel commercials from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you're whoa, goddamn, you could have had a completely different life just doing commercials in the world of fashion and all those kind of, prestige brands and that sort of thing. They're incredibly stylish. And of course, he also got tapped to direct the 1984 commercial, which aired once during the Super Bowl to announce the arrival of the original Macintosh computer. And I feel like anytime Steve Jobs is tapping you to usher in a new era where you're introducing the Mac instead of the Apple II, well, you're doing something right. And back when I was in business school, every single class that I took on business innovation or marketing or anything along those lines, this commercial would always come up about a clear moment in Apple's history where they decided to go in a completely new direction and change the brand and change the flavor. And it was just a major moment in the development of consumer technology, but also just some world-class filmmaking. But I think I've procrastinated enough at this point. I have a lot of movies to get to, and I apologize in advance if one of your favorite Ridley Scott movies happens to be my number 27 or my number 26. It just shows how he's got a very deep bench of really interesting movies, or at least he's got a lot of terrible movies in his filmography that'll have a great performance or a great concept or a great poster or a great something that'll make it worth watching. There's no movie on here that is not worth at least checking out for the first time and forming your own opinion. And in that, I'm one of those guys that is prone to kind of hero worship or place my favorite filmmakers on a pedestal and worship them like a god. I guess it's appropriate if I start on the weekend and talk a lot of shit, because by the time I get to the end of the video, I'm going to be so tired and my voice will be getting so hoarse, I won't be able to embarrass myself by showering, but so much praise on his best movies. So let's just dive right in with my number 27, A Good Year from 2006. Now, after the success of Gladiator, it's only natural that Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe would want to work together again. And I think they've worked together 5 times, maybe 6 times, but I think the worst of their collaborations is a good year. And I think the reality is Ridley does not excel at light and silly and breezy and inconsequential. He needs big topics. He likes creating worlds. He likes recreating eras, or at a minimum, embracing a really kind of dry, aggressive, mean-spirited sense of humor. I think a movie like Matchstick Men, which is not one of his best, but it's much better than this, that's much more his speed when it comes to his style of humor. I think A Good Year is kind of an unwatchable misfire, but if you're a wine enthusiast, you might find some value. Marion Cotillard is beautiful as always. She's absolutely incredible. And there are a few kind of, randy, raunchy jokes about the legality of having sex with one's cousin in France and all that kind of stuff. And I guess if you love the topic or if you love the performers, definitely check it out. But it is my least favorite movie by Ridley Scott. But a very close competitor for that slot also stars Russell Crowe. Body of Lies from 2008, 2 years later. I think this movie is just empty calories with terrible performances and just a completely, totally generic Middle Eastern kind of action thriller concept. And after 9/11 and the war in Iraq, we saw a lot of movies in the early part of the 21st century dealing with struggles in the Middle East. And sometimes we would get interesting movies like The Hurt Locker and things like that. And sometimes we'd get movies like Body of Lies, where if Leonardo DiCaprio has a worse performance in his filmography, I'm not aware of it. And for whatever reason, in the aughts and the teens, Ridley started doing this thing where he'd put these really awful-looking contact lenses on his actors, and you see it again in Robin Hood with like Oscar Isaac wearing blue contact lenses, and it just makes him look like a total freak. And Leonardo, he's one of the most beloved kind of elf-like beautiful men over the last 30 years that women have absolutely completely totally become infatuated with. Why would you make your leading man less attractive and give him a lame accent and a lame haircut and lame contact lenses? Leo does not look like Leo. You can tell that it is Leo. He's never looked less attractive, but it's like first rule of show business. No matter what you do to your stars, they have to look glamorous and beautiful and sexy and cool. And when blockbuster movies lose sight of that, typically the box office starts to go down and the overall product is less satisfying. But if you are a sucker for Middle Eastern action thrillers where people like Russell Crowe are doing really lame kind of, he's trying to do this kind of aw shucks rural American accent, and it just sounds so inauthentic. Not as inauthentic as Anne Bancroft and G.I. Jane, but we'll get to G.I. Jane a little later. But let's stop talking about Body of Lies. Let's talk about another horrendous movie, Exodus, Gods and Kings from 2014, which is my number 25. I think this is the last big historical epic where Hollywood was willing to put a lot of actors, very prominent actors, in brownface for a big budget movie about Egypt. If you are obsessed with the story of Moses and the Pharaoh and the Ten Commandments, there are other movies that you're better off seeing, like The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. The Ten Commandments is one of the top 10 most popular movies ever made in the United States. I think it's ranked like number 6 or 7 in terms of total ticket sales. It is the most successful historical epic released from the 1950s. So I get that people are trying to recapture that success, that prestige, that emotion. And it's very sweet seeing this movie being dedicated to his brother, Tony Scott, who had died right before the release of this movie. And it's got the occasional good scene, like when God starts unleashing his wrath on all of Egypt and doing all the biblical plague stuff. There's an alligator feeding frenzy scene where I'm like, God damn, some of the most aggressive shit that I've ever seen. And every once in a while, the movie will give us a stunning shot of these incredible vistas of kind of the high watermark of classical Egyptian culture with all the various sphinxes and pyramids and all that crap. I mean, it absolutely looks gorgeous. But it's long and it's slow and it's boring. And no matter how much Christian Bale might roar and scream, this is during Christian Bale's roaring phase after all the Batman movies. The emotion's just not there. The sweep and scope is just not there. Ridley Scott has made many more historical epics that are much more impressive. But number 24, House of Gucci from 2021, a movie which has been an object of ridicule for over the last 2 years. I saw it for the first time getting prepared for this video, and I have to admit, all the jokes and all the ridicule were totally warranted. I mean, Al Pacino has never been worse. Jared Leto has never been worse. But Lady Gaga was strangely fascinating and compelling, and every time she was on screen, which was like half the movie, I was like, you know what, this movie is terrible, and it's just it's as empty and vapid as I find the world of fashion to be. But Lady Gaga was just absolutely fascinating. She just holds nothing back. She hurls herself into this performance. I think House of Gucci is worth seeing just so we can appreciate how far Lady Gaga has come as an actress and what she's capable of. But if you want to watch it and just make fun of everybody for their horrendous Italian accents, I totally get it. So where are we? 23. I'm going to go with Alien Covenant from 2017. I totally understood when Ridley came back to the franchise with Prometheus, where he was really trying to just kind of wow everybody and show everybody that he still had some gas left in the tank when it came to that world, which he helped create, and that just that overall look and aesthetic. I feel like Alien Covenant, which is a bridge too far, where it has some interesting scenes. Like, I thought the most interesting stuff is when we see Michael Fassbender's character, anything dealing just with him, like when he returns to the planet of the engineers and basically commits complete and total genocide using their weapons against them. It's like, this is some of the most evil and just apocalyptic sci-fi that I've ever seen. I just could not fucking believe what I was seeing. And I really like the ending as well when we see him starting to hatch his master plan and what he's got cooking in the oven. But there's also a lot about this movie that just feels like a retread and a repeat of things that were done better in 1979. And the audience made their displeasure known loud and clear. This movie only grossed $240 million worldwide, whereas Prometheus grossed $400 worldwide. And Prometheus is heavily flawed, and it's got a lot of things you can easily criticize. But I think overall it just feels like a more complete experience as opposed to Alien Covenant. So I don't recommend Alien Covenant. I guess of all the Alien movies that have ever been made, where does it rank? Like, is it better than Resurrection? Probably, maybe. I don't think it's better than David Fincher's Alien 3, but it's a contender for the worst Alien movie. Or maybe Alien versus Predator 2, but anyway, the less said about those crossover movies, the better. So let's move on to number 22, a movie that was made for the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus sailing across the ocean blue. What's that? The old rhyme? In the summer of 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But this movie, it's a mixed bag at best. And in that this movie is about a figure of controversy, I guess it makes sense that it stars yet another figure of great controversy, Gerard Depardieu, however the hell you say his name, and I'm not going to get sidetracked talking about Gerard Depardieu, but it's interesting casting. I mean, he's obviously very French and speaks with a very outrageous French accent, but the movie does give us some incredibly striking sequences that only Ridley Scott knows how to shoot. I mean, the movie can feel a little long and a little boring at times, and I get why it was a big bomb, and it really derailed Ridley Scott's career. I mean, after Thelma and Louise had been this huge hit only a year prior, suddenly his career was in tatters, and it took him 4 years to get another movie going. But I think if you're making a movie about Christopher Columbus, maybe don't wait until 36 minutes into the movie to show him actually starting his journey. Like, talk about the stuff that happened in Europe, like in flashbacks, but get the journey going. But watching those boats sailing across the Atlantic, all to the music of Vangelis, I mean, it's the kind of super cool, stylish filmmaking that only Ridley Scott and his brother Tony are capable of doing. And I think the movie's worth seeing just to watch Michael Wincott in action. And Michael Wincott plays a character named Moxica, but he's such a lethal, total badass villain. He's one of those villains where he looks so cool on horseback. He never wants to get off horseback. And I feel like you can make a whole movie about him just killing people and doing horrible things while on horseback. But between the hair and the armor and the sword, he makes one hell of a villain. And we've got Sigourney Weaver reuniting with Ridley Scott in here. We've got Fernando Rey, who's really cool in here. There's some good actors in here. If you love historical epics, 1492 Conquest of Paradise is worth a look, but Ridley has made better movies in this particular genre. And what's hilarious is how 1492 is one of those movies that had a rival production racing it to the screen, which happened a lot in the 90s, where you had movies like The Hot Spot, which never came out, racing to beat Outbreak to the screen. And you had Volcano and Dante's Peak, and you had Deep Impact and Armageddon. Like, the creative bankruptcy exhibited by some people in the 90s was truly extraordinary. But in 1992, I saw Christopher Columbus: The Discovery in the theater, which is a way worse movie. It's a terrible movie, but somehow I guess we just got confused about which of the productions was like the more prestigious. So my family, we went to see the wrong Columbus movie back in the day. But let's keep going because we still have a long way to go. Number 21, Robin Hood from 2010. I feel like this is one of those movies where they had the budget, they had the cast, they had the concept, but they forgot the fun, they forgot the high adventure, they forgot the story. And I've seen a lot of different adaptations of Robin Hood or explorations of Robin Hood. Michael Curtiz's Adventures of Robin Hood is probably my favorite. I love the songs and the animated Disney tune, and of course Robin and Marian, required viewing, especially if you love Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn. And of course, you need to read Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which is a damn good novel, which is centuries old, and it still reads like a rip-roaring, kick-ass, like fantasy adventure story, just without the fantasy. But so much about this movie just feels like this long, exhausting, joyless chore, where the movie's trying to hit all the appropriate beats, but just the dialogue rings hollow. The music is like strangely unemotional and just unaffecting. And you've got some astonishingly beautiful women in here. We got Léa Seydoux and Cate Blanchett looking like absolute goddesses. They were very well cast. The rest of the cast maybe less so. It's one of those movies that has a strange mix or strange jumble of different accents. And it makes me wonder how many people from England have actually had the privilege of playing Robin Hood. I mean, I grew up watching the Kevin Costner version. He doesn't sound particularly English. And then, of course, Errol Flynn is not from England.
Welcome to Sherwood, my lady.
And obviously, Russell Crowe is not from England, and he's using a really strange accent. Like, Russell Crowe is very Australian. Just let him speak like an Australian. But he's kind of sort of trying to manipulate his accent just a little bit. But when asked about his accent in an interview while promoting the movie, he walked out of the interview. And maybe I guess the biggest alarming sign ahead of this flick was when Ridley Scott said his favorite version of Robin Hood was Robin Hood Men in Tights by Mel Brooks, which actually does have an actor with a real English accent. But I think the main reason this movie doesn't play, it was a planned two-part story. And because this movie went way over budget, I think the original budget, it was $155 million, but it ballooned to $200 million. But the movie stops right where it really should have gotten started, because they really drag out Robin Hood becoming the outlaw Robin Hood. I don't think he even becomes an outlaw. I wrote down a time code. He becomes an outlaw at the 2-hour, 9-minute mark. And I just feel like, they should have just stopped, scrapped the whole movie, started the movie right then, and then teased in all the stuff from the Crusades and Richard the Lionheart and kind of added that in flashback. And because it only grossed, actually it's one of the 5 highest grossing movies Ridley Scott's ever made. It grossed 321. That is not a success if a movie's made for $200 million. You need to make at least 400 in order to be a profitable film. And apparently Russell Crowe and Ridley Scott did not get along on this movie, and they have never worked together again. So let's move on to number 20. G.I. Jane from 1997, a movie that had been totally, completely forgotten by the outside world until the Oscars, a year and a half ago? Or I can't even remember. When was the slap? Was it 2021 or 2022? In any case, Chris Rock made a G.I. Jane joke, and now this movie will be remembered forever. And I can vividly recall at age 21 deliberately and willfully skipping the shit out of this movie just because of the name. I'd played with G.I. Joe action figures throughout the 80s, or part of the 80s. And I just didn't have any interest in seeing this. But having now seen it for the first time in preparation for this video, it's got some stuff in there which I think is interesting. Like, Demi Moore was such a physical specimen at this time and got so jacked and so athletic. She looks like she's carved out of bronze. And she had gotten in incredible shape the previous year for Striptease, where she had a very different build. Here, it's all about, push-ups and squats and that sort of thing. And the Navy SEAL training sequences, I don't know if Demi Moore could really survive that. It's probably the most brutal training for any sort of military career anywhere in the world. But I find that stuff absolutely riveting because Viggo Mortensen is just so cruel and so vicious and so hardcore. And watching just how savage and dark and adversarial their relationship becomes throughout the course of the training, it goes to the edge of the abyss, culminating in her famous "suck my dick" line. And then it comes back and they bond and they end up working together and sharing a mission together. And I think watching their exchanges going back and forth, it is worth watching. But goddamn, Anne Bancroft, who I love from The Graduate, she is truly unwatchable in this. Like, of all the kind of bad, fake Southern drawls, kind of like inauthentic DC accents that I've ever seen an actor whip out for a movie, Anne Bancroft might be the heavyweight champion in G.I. Jane. So here we are. We're in the top 20 of Ridley Scott's career, and the movies are starting to get more interesting to watch. So let's get into the teens. Number 19, All the Money in the World from 2017, a movie which I saw for the first time for this video, a movie which famously starred Kevin Spacey. Then Kevin Spacey had all these allegations explode in his face, no pun intended, and they reshot all of his scenes with Christopher Plummer. And I don't know if those measures were justified or not. I honestly haven't really followed the scandals related to Kevin Spacey at all over the last couple of years. But Christopher Plummer, he's a damn good actor. I love Christopher Plummer. Going back to The Man Who Would Be King, shot by John Huston, Christopher Plummer is an incredible actor. And he's playing J. Paul Getty during the famous kidnapping scandal in the early 70s when his grandson is kidnapped by a bunch of crazy-ass Italian Marxists. And J. Paul Getty's attitude is, well, like, I don't ever pay full price for anything. So he's playing hardball when it comes to getting his grandson back. But all the money in the world's got some good performances by Michelle Williams and Mark Wahlberg. And is written, or at least one of the writers was David Scarpa, and David Scarpa has been writing a lot for Ridley, or at least he wrote that. And he's also got Napoleon, and he's also got Gladiator 2. So Ridley clearly has found a screenwriter that he likes. And like, as I mentioned before earlier in my video, if he finds an editor that he likes, or a DP that he likes, or a composer that he likes, he uses them again and again and again. And David Scarpa, right now, he's cranking out scripts for Ridley, and more power to him. I hope he does a great job moving forward. But number 18, another movie which I skipped at the time of its release, White Squall from 1996, a movie which was not a success. It only grossed about like 10 million, which is one of Ridley's lowest box office performers. But it ended his cold streak of inactivity after 1492. This was his quote-unquote comeback. And it's basically Dead Poet Society, but on water, where you have a really tough but fair guy teaching young boys like the value of hard work and teamwork and just learning how to sail like total fucking badasses. And it's an incredibly inspiring movie, and it works pretty well. Jeff Bridges is absolutely incredible in it. It's a true story from 1960 based on a book called The Last Voyage of the Albatross by Charles Geig Jr. and Felix Sutton, but the movie, for whatever reason, just didn't resonate with the public. Maybe the giant white squall at the heart of the movie shouldn't have come at the very end of the movie. Like, maybe they should have shown it earlier and then teased the rest through flashbacks. I feel like they held the big money shot too deep into the movie. But if you are a Ryan Philippe fan, you can see a very young Ryan Philippe screaming and crying. And I can remember watching the trailer in the theater and seeing that part where he's screaming and crying and climbing up into the rigging and
You hating this?
I remember at the time thinking, that looks totally ridiculous. And that scene, watching it in its entirety in the movie, it did not disappoint. But like I said, if you love Dead Poet Society and want to see basically a very similar phenomenon unfold with a sailboat, check out White Squall. Not Ridley's best, but certainly not his worst. We're getting into some of the movies that actually start getting pretty good, like number 17, Matchstick Men from 2003. Now, I just saw Matchstick Men for the first time, and I did enjoy it, and I love movies about con artists and grifters, and I feel like The Grifters is a much better movie if you like movies about grifters. It's very aptly named, but Alison Lohman is good in this, Sam Rockwell's good in this, and Nicolas Cage is fucking fantastic in this. And I can remember when it came out, there was a feeling that like Ridley's comeback, or the momentum he'd established with Gladiator, Hannibal, and Black Hawk Down, how that was over. And that loss of momentum continued into several of the movies that he would make in a row. And this is one of those periods where I just stopped watching Ridley's movies. I think there was a period from basically Black Hawk Down up through American Gangster, where I wasn't seeing any of Ridley's movies in the theater. I can't even explain why, but they just were not grabbing my attention. And after American Gangster, I started getting back into his flicks. But I think Matchstick Men, it was a mistake on my part to skip it at the time of its release. In this movie, tonally, it's all over the place, and it takes a long time to get going, but where it really finds that special gear is when the character played by Alison Lohman insists upon her father teaching her the art of the con, and that gets really fun and really entertaining. And I love how she basically says, like, unless you teach me the art of the con, I'm going to tell you all these horrible, inappropriate sex stories that you don't want to hear. And just as a way of changing the subject, Nicolas Cage finally relents. But because this is a movie about con artists and grifters and whatnot, of course, there are a lot of unpredictable twists and turns throughout it. So maybe it feels like it could have been more like a Gore Verbinski movie as opposed to a Ridley Scott movie, but I was actually surprised by how much I enjoyed it when watching it for the first time. But number 16, I mentioned before, American Gangster, as the movie that kind of brought me back to Ridley. 2007, I had kind of taken a break from Ridley's movies when he released Matchstick Men, Kingdom of Heaven, and A Good Year. I just saw Kingdom of Heaven for the first time, which we'll get to much deeper in the video. But American Gangster brought me back, but even though it brought me back, then I immediately started skipping his movies again. I skipped Body of Lies and I skipped Robin Hood. I guess that was like the low point of my interest in Ridley Scott's career, like during the aughts, and I just felt like he'd kind of been rudderless or lost direction. And then it was actually Prometheus, which brought me back into the fold. But yeah, then I skipped The Counselor when it came out. I skipped Exodus. I mean, I guess I've been a very bad Ridley Scott fan. But then a movie like The Martian or Alien Covenant will bring me back. But I dip in and out. Like I said, I'd only seen half of his movies prior to getting prepared for this video. But American Gangster, honestly barely remember it. I'm ranking it pretty highly just because I remember seeing it in the theater in 2007 and loving Denzel. And what I really liked, there's a big scene in Greensboro, North Carolina, which I lived for a long time. I lived there from 1985 up through 1999 when I moved to Los Angeles. And I remember feeling very sentimental when they showed some scenes in Greensboro, North Kakalaki, or the G-Spot as we like to call it. But if you like gangster movies and you like Denzel, definitely check it out. But if somebody were to put a gun to my head and say, explain the plot of American Gangster, or explain like break down some of the best scenes. I mean, Russell Crowe's in this. I don't remember a thing that he said. Steven Zaillian's one of the writers. He was a big screenwriter at that time. So this is one of those situations where I'm just going to have to trust in my impressions from 16 years ago where I liked this movie, I enjoyed this movie, but I barely remember this movie, so put that in your pipe and smoke it. But let's get to my number 15, The Martian from 2015, which was a monster hit for Ridley. It was his biggest hit to date, his most popular movie. It grossed $630 million worldwide. And it's just incredible to me how Ridley has been able to reinvent himself so many times over the course of his career, where he'll have flop after flop after flop, or movies that just kind of vanish. Then he'll come roaring back with a giant movie. And I get it. I saw this sucker in the theater. It's got a great cast. It's got an entertaining screenplay, a great concept, a great hook. Like anytime you can do a science fiction movie that feels like science fiction that's kind of just over the hill, like technology that we might be about to discover and embrace, you're onto something. And obviously Mars, it's in our future. But I've not revisited the movie since I saw it in the theater, but I remember having a really good time. I've even got a written, at this point, by the time this movie came out, I'd started writing reviews on a blog or a website somewhere. And so if you look long and hard, you'll be able to find my written review for The Martian somewhere. It might be on the website for Wrong Reel, but I like it. I don't love it. But now it's time to get into the top 14, kind of the better half of his movies. And we still have some flawed films here. And I'm saying that just assuming that Napoleon will be fine, but it won't crack into his top 10. I'm assuming wherever I end up ranking Napoleon in the overall 28, it's already behind us. Maybe I'm being unfair, but the trailer didn't necessarily give me great vibrations. But for number 14, I'm going with Prometheus from 2012, which is the second most popular movie of Ridley's career with a little over 400 million worldwide. And if you're one of those people with a lot of justifiable criticisms against Prometheus, I totally share your frustrations. I think it's a deeply flawed movie, but the reason I rank it so highly is that it's got iconic imagery where you really see what Ridley Scott is capable of when he's firing on all cylinders, at least from a visual standpoint. Just the look of the world, the look of the ship, the look of this technology. It was just a fascinating, dark, forbidding, kind of terrifying world. And I love it when science fiction kind of bleeds into the world of horror, especially in a way where it excites your imagination, where you want to fill in the gaps and you want to learn more about these people. Like, who are these fucking psychos that designed all this technology? And I think my main criticism of this movie is that it feels like one of those screenplays where they had a lot of good ideas to get the project started. They didn't have a lot of ideas for where the movie should end or how it should wrap up. I mean, case in point would be watching Charlize Theron running at a mad dash as a ship is rolling after her. It's like, you know what? Go left, go right, but you're gonna get squashed. Don't do something stupid like that. And that gets very frustrating when a movie that starts off kind of smart or kind of clever slowly gets more dumb and less interesting. And that whole final scene where the xenomorph ended up ripping out of that body at the end, it just seemed tacked on, like they hadn't even really thought about like why the movie should end at that particular spot. But there's some scenes that are truly revolting, like watching Noomi Rapace cutting herself open, trying to get this goddamn parasite out of her that's growing really, really quickly. Some of the most disgusting shit that I've ever seen. And I remember going to see this in the theater where I dragged my my 10-year-old brother along, and he does not like science fiction or horror movies. And it was just hilarious watching him just convulse in terror. He basically kind of wrapped around my arm, and I just kept saying like, don't worry, it's just a movie, blah, blah, blah. But watching him freak out was almost more entertaining than watching the flick. And I can remember, I can still vividly recall, the movie didn't start right, or it started and then it stopped, and they were trying to like fix the projector, and the entire audience was chanting in unison, "Fix your shit! fix your shit. I mean, New Yorkers can be very aggressive if their movie does not start on time. But a word to the wise to writer Damon Lindelof, whose reputation has definitely declined since the release of this movie. Don't make your movie stupid and don't make your characters stupid, because it's very frustrating to audiences who are expecting a high level of storytelling that they remember from Alien and Aliens, and to a lesser degree, Alien 3. But when you're dealing with science fiction royalty, kind of the gold standard for this great genre, bring your A game or don't bring it at all. So, like I said, deeply flawed movie, but it is disturbing at times. And Charlize Theron was very easy on the eyes. I loved Michael Fassbender. I loved Idris Elba. I love Sean Harris. I mean, it's a good cast, but flawed film. But let's move on because I'm starting to lose my voice. We still got like half the movies left, so let's try and power through. Number 13, Someone to Watch Over Me from 1987. I have a soft spot for this movie. It's not a good movie, but I love those late 80s New York thrillers with a lot of sex appeal and a lot of violence. And Mimi Rogers, this looks fantastic in this. Lorraine Bracco is sexy as hell in this. There was a period in the late 80s and early 90s where, for whatever reason, we had a lot of filmmakers making very stylish, very cool, very moody and atmospheric thrillers set in New York. It was a great time for independent film in New York, but also a great time for like gangster movies and cop thrillers and that sort of thing. Movies like Bad Lieutenant or King of New York. But this movie was a total bomb, grossed $10.3 million. Tom Berenger, though, he's really goddamn good. He's basically playing the bodyguard to an incredibly wealthy, powerful woman while she's being kind of stalked and hunted by, not a serial killer, but more just like an organized gangster figure. So while he's guarding her body on a day-to-day basis, naturally, they fall in love. They start having a very inappropriate affair, which wreaks havoc on Tom Berenger's personal life, but goddamn, if you're a sucker for this period and this topic like I am, and you like seeing these kinds of movies shot with incredible style, Someone to Watch Over Me might surprise you, but it ain't the best movie in Ridley Scott's career, but it's certainly not the worst. All those movies are behind us. But let's get into number 12, The Counselor from 2013, a movie where you have an astonishing cast and one of my all-time favorite writers, Cormac McCarthy, and a really good director. But does it deliver? And I would say that it does not deliver on what we want to see, but it does deliver enough to make it worth watching. And Cormac McCarthy had gotten very much in vogue around this time with movie adaptations of his books, but this was an original screenplay. It was a spec script written by Cormac McCarthy, but The Road had brought a lot of attention to him. If you've never read The Road will absolutely blow my mind, and I never saw the movie adaptation of The Road. And obviously No Country for Old Men, which I think definitely helped a whole new generation of people discover the work of Cormac McCarthy. We'll see if Blood Meridian can deliver. But I love watching mature, edgy, fucked up thrillers with great actors indulging in really filthy dialogue, and seeing like Penelope Cruz and Michael Fassbender just like entwined in bed at the beginning and like indulging in a little oral sex and that sort of thing. It's very sexy. It's very provocative. Cameron Diaz is incredibly sexy and incredibly provocative. And I think the whole movie is worth watching just for one scene where Javier Bardem's character explains how Cameron Diaz decided or announced that she was going to fuck his car and then proceeded to do so. And when he's comparing like what he saw through the windshield to like a catfish or a bottom feeder in a fish tank, I mean, I nearly broke a rib. I was laughing so hard.
One of those bottom feeders you see going up the side of the aquarium, sucking his way up the glass.
And Cameron Diaz, she's just so game and so sexy. And even though this movie never really takes off, it always feels like it's just about to explode and get really good, but it just never quite gets there. It does have these moments of eerie beauty, like seeing these cheetahs with jeweled collars hopping out of a car and then like just chilling by the dead body of Javier Bardem's character. It's just a bone-chilling moment that I'll never forget. Or the scene where Brad Pitt encounters one of those neck slicer devices that he describes early on in the movie. It's just an incredible payoff, seeing him be the guy who's on the receiving end of this device after that really lurid, just terrifying description of the device early in the movie. And really the only reason this movie exists is because Ridley Scott tried for years to bring Cormac McCarthy's novel Blood Meridian to the screen. He kept failing, so there was an opportunity to buy the screenplay for The Counselor. He leapt at the opportunity, met with Cormac McCarthy, bought the screenplay then and there, and maybe the movie would have been better if Ridley Scott's brother Tony had not died in the middle of production. He actually shut down production and went to spend time with his family in Los Angeles, and then he returned to London to resume production a few days or a few weeks later. But this is a movie that I think is a one of those strange curiosities. It's interesting. If you love the people involved, you got to see it, but it's just like a near miss with becoming like one of those great kind of crime thriller classics that it wants to be, but it just never quite gets there. All right, now we have one last movie before we get to my official top 10, and this is yet another one of those movies where I saw it in the theater and have not revisited it since, and my memories might be, somewhat in question or unreliable, but I'm going to go with Black Hawk Down from 2001, and I can remember on the set of Hannibal seeing copies of this book kind of being scattered around because a lot of Ridley's crew was starting to read the book because that was going to be their next flick as soon as Hannibal wrapped. And I think they shot this in more or less the same location where they had just shot Gladiator the year before. But Black Hawk Down, holy crap, it is a tense, gripping, brutal, violent movie. And I can remember being in high school when the events of the movie were unfolding in real time, and just some of the covers that we were seeing to magazines at the time and some of the newsreel footage. It's as dark and ugly as military conflicts get. And he put together an incredible cast. I remember Tom Sizemore being good. I remember Ewan McGregor not being good. It's one of those things where you get like a cast of like 15 or 20 names. Some people have better scenes than others. But Josh Hartnett was good. But goddamn, if you want to watch 2 hours of just balls to the wall, violence and conflict and terror. And I can remember there's one scene where I was squirming in my chair where they're trying to squeeze off and prevent from bleeding a femoral artery in somebody's leg. And they're basically like reaching into his leg and like squeezing with their hand, and he's just like writhing in pain. And it was pretty gruesome, pretty horrific, but goddamn, Ridley Scott, he has never been squeamish when it comes to violence. But let's get into the top 10, where we're going to have a lot of violence to discuss, in particular in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, the director's cut roadshow version. I never saw the 2005 theatrical release. I've only seen the director's cut, so I can't do a fair comparison. But if you like medieval violence, this movie does deliver. And the story captures an absolutely fascinating chapter of history where Europeans have held Jerusalem for 100 years. The story begins in 1184, and it takes us right up to the point where Jerusalem falls and gets reclaimed by the Arab world. And this is before the time of Richard the Lionheart and his 3-year crusade. But goddamn, if you want to watch the European world and the Middle Eastern world collide with everybody wearing gorgeous armor and just some truly horrific, brutal combat, I'd argue that when this movie's working well, and there's scenes where it does, but when the movie's really working well, particularly during the siege warfare, and you're seeing like the movement of the troops and the strategy, I think those battle scenes are even better and more satisfying than some of the similar scenes in a movie like Return of the King, which came out 2 years earlier. And obviously Return of the King is a fantasy experience, whereas this is a historical epic. But it does have a similar feeling of otherworldliness. Like there's so many interesting characters, like the one played by Ed Norton. Hang on, I wrote down the name of the king that he plays. Oh shit, I can't even read my own notes. Baldwin the Fourth, there it is. But he's the leper king wearing that metal mask, and he's one of those guys who was a total badass in his teen years. He thought he was going to live to be 100, but because he's got leprosy, he's only going to live to be about 30. But he was well loved by both the Western and Middle Eastern world, and he was a great advocate for peace. But when he finally moves on, that's when it's time for the bloodshed to flow. And I think the only real weak link in this movie is Orlando Bloom, and I know he was coming off hot of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but imagine if this movie had featured a young Daniel Craig or someone like that instead of Orlando Bloom, like someone who has the gravitas to hold a movie like this together. I think Orlando Bloom should have been in it, but he should not have been the lead. He's not a strong enough actor. And there's so many other incredible actors in here, like Alexander Siddig, he's really good. Liam Neeson's really good. David Thewlis is really good. Jeremy Irons is really good. Ava Green, she's so beautiful in this movie that the only sane response is just to shriek and scream like a banshee while you're watching it. And I think some of my favorite bits are when Liam Neeson is describing, like, what are the virtues of being a knight? What makes a knight? Is it all the hours you've spent training and learning your craft? Or is it an adherence to the truth, even if it means your own life? Is it protecting the weak from those who are strong? Like, the way he articulates the values of a knight and then smacks Orlando Bloom across the face and says, and that's so you remember it. I love that shit. So if you love kind of badass, hardcore, medieval epics, definitely check this out. But it ain't short. It's 3 hours and 14 minutes long. It's got an overture. It's got an intermission. But it did crack my top 10. And for that, I'm thrilled that I decided to finally check it out in preparation for this video. And for my number 9, we're going with a movie where I can't even begin to be impartial or look at it objectively because I worked on it. We're going with Hannibal from 2001, a movie which I believe I saw it at the cast and crew screening, and then I saw it again in the theater with my parents. And I don't think I've seen it in its entirety since then. I remember I was in Vegas working in the accounting department on America's Sweetheart. It's a pretty terrible movie, but my parents came to visit and Hannibal was playing. I was like, all right, let's go see Hannibal. So my memories are a little unreliable, but I did read the book and I did enjoy working on the movie and I did enjoy reading all the different drafts of the screenplay. But both the book and the movie, I think, suffer from a pretty weak, lackluster ending. I don't like the ending in the book. I don't like the ending in the flick. It's just one of those things where all the writers should have gone back to the drawing board and found a way to really end it in the most devastating fashion possible, because Silence of the Lambs does end in the most devastating fashion possible. Between that confrontation with the infrared and the dark, and then followed by Anthony going off and saying, I'm going to have an old friend for dinner. It was just marvelous. Like, Silence of the Lambs is a justifiable classic. But Hannibal does have some extraordinary sequences with some horrific brutality. I mean, all this stuff with like the man-eating pigs and, Gary Oldman's character Mason Verger all crippled and all that crazy makeup. One of my favorite moments from the making of that movie was when I was walking through the woods in Asheville, North Carolina. I was trying to get from, I was trying to get to where we were shooting versus where all the trucks were. And I bumped into Gary Oldman in full makeup, and seeing him come out of the dark with all the Mason Verger makeup on, just walk. I think he might have even been smoking a cigarette. I was like, whoa! It really gave me the heebie-jeebies. So he brought it, and it was a lot. I very briefly got to interact with him when I was invited into his trailer to help fix his TV, because everybody was having problems with their TV getting reception. It was 2000, the technology wasn't quite there. And I'd managed to fix the TV for Dino De Laurentiis when he was trying to watch World Cup soccer. So I developed a reputation for knowing how to fix the TV. But it's just a crazy movie, crazy experience. I think the movie is flawed, but I have a lot of sentimental affection for it. And I think all the stuff in Italy with Giancarlo Giannini, that's probably the best stuff in the movie. But I'm starting to get a little delirious and lose track of what I've been saying. And we still have 8 movies to go, so let's push on. Number 8, The Last Duel from 2021. It wasn't that long ago where I was reviewing this movie on this channel, so if you want to see what I had to say about The Last Duel, I guess in greater length, definitely hunt down that video. And I can remember Ridley Scott having some really disparaging words to say about people in general when this movie was a giant flop. I mean, this movie lost all the money that was invested in. It was a big, high-profile production. You had big actors like Adam Driver and Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and was it Jodie Comer? I always forget how to say her name. Hang on. The Last Duel stars. Boom, 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 boom. Jodie Comer. That's how you say her name. Anyway, she's fantastic in it. But I love these movies where you get to have that kind of Rashomon experience where you watch one story from 3 different points of view. It's like that old expression, like in every story there is like your version and my version, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. Same holds true here. But the reason I like The Last Duel so much, I mean, first and foremost, it's just a great depiction of that world, even though you don't have any French-speaking people or any people with French accents in the movie, but just seeing the end of medieval times, and we're just entering a more modern period, but people still know how to get together and joust and battle and have a melee. And that final battle between Adam Driver and Matt Damon fucking rocks. It is horrific. It is brutal, and the way it ends is just so goddamn savage. And I can't remember exactly what Ridley said when the movie came out, but he basically said because people are stupid and illiterate and spend too much time on their phones, they don't have the attention span to watch an historical epic. And maybe there's something to that. I mean, I don't think the world has ever lacked for stupid, ignorant people. Like, no period in history is unique in that respect. You just get different kinds of stupidity and different forms of intelligence. But it is hard for an audience where they've watched nothing but Harry Potter and Marvel and DC to suddenly switch gears and try to watch a real historical epic. They haven't really been trained, and I do think you need to train the audience with good movies in order to have them appreciate that kind of movie. But I don't know why people didn't show up. Why did people show up for Oppenheimer and not for The Last Duel? I cannot explain why, but I did enjoy The Last Duel. I have no problem putting it in Ridley's top 10. I think it's well worth hunting down. I hope that history will be kind to it in 10 years' time. Like when Ridley finally pushes on to filmmaker heaven, how will people regard The Last Duel? Anyway, only time will tell. But for number 7, we had the first movie directed by Ridley Scott, which I ever saw at the time of its release. I didn't see it in the theater, but I saw it on HBO 1,000 times, 10,000 times. I have no idea. Legend from 1985, a movie which I can totally concede at age 47 is a mess. But when I first saw this, I was just falling in love with fantasy due to Dungeons and Dragons and some fantasy novels and video games like Dragon Slayer. I was on the cusp of becoming very, very into the fantasy genre. And so it never even occurred to me that when it comes to the fantasy genre that like some might be good and some might be bad or some might be a mix of the two. Like I'd seen Conan the Barbarian in the theater and loved it. And I'd seen like Beastmaster a billion times on TV. I was getting really into it. And so I would watch any fantasy movie. It didn't matter if they were good or bad because I couldn't tell the difference. And so what works about this movie? Well, let's start with the special effects and makeup by Rob Bottin mixed with the performance by Tim Curry.
What are we here? A little boy.
And when I revisited the movie the other night, I couldn't believe just how precious little footage there is of that astonishing makeup mixed with that brilliant performance. But just those two creators coming together, that makes the movie 100% worth seeing. And also, I had a big crush on Mia Sara at the time due to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I think maybe I'd seen Ferris Bueller's first, or maybe this first. We're talking about very old memories. But there's also that great swamp creature, which has some of the best practical effects at that time. Like, it's just a brief little scene just so we can see Tom Cruise in armor, killing a monster. But you want to talk about a movie going the extra mile. Like, compare that swamp creature to some of the digital vomit that we see today. I mean, they're not even in the same conversation. And after the commercial failure and or disappointment of Blade Runner, this really put Ridley Scott's career in jeopardy. It only grossed $15.5 million. And then his next movie, Someone to Watch Over Me, that also was a flop. So suddenly Ridley was in real career trouble. Black Rain put him back in the black. But Legend did really interrupt his career. And I think the reason it was a failure is that it places heavy emphasis on fairies and sprites and unicorns and like creatures of the forest. And I think people in general, when they think of medieval fantasy or just fantasy in general, they want people like with armor, they want wizards, they want like badass medieval fantasy as opposed to fairy tales. And I'm just not that into fairy tales. Maybe there's a giant audience out there that fucking loves fairy tales. I am not one of them. But because I was 9 when this came out, I was a little more forgiving. Even like the really cheesy pop music that pops up at the end, I watched it with total sincerity. And even though there have been subsequent different versions of the movie since then that have different soundtracks, if I'm watching Legend, I need the crappy version that I saw as a kid just to kind of get back in touch with those memories. And so I cannot claim that Legend is a good movie, but it's definitely a movie. I might have seen it more than any other movie on this list just because of the time and place that I was in when it came out. So y'all tell me, what do you think about Legend all these years later? But for my number 6, let's talk about a movie that has aged really well. Thelma and Louise from 1991. And it's funny, looking back on this movie, like in the early 90s culture, the culture war was different then, but this movie really stirred people up at the time, and a lot of people objected to how some of the men in the movie are portrayed. They seem to turn a blind eye to how some of the more noble men in the movie are also portrayed. Like, for every character like Brad Pitt, there's a character like, what the hell's his name? I'm losing the ability even to speak, but a character like the one played by Michael Madsen, who's in full dreamboat mode. So I think if you're looking to be offended, that you could find plenty of reasons to be offended by Thelma and Louise, but this is an undeniably good movie. It's just fucking awesome. When you get to the end of the movie, even if you don't like the movie, I think you'd have to have a heart made of stone not to feel your spirit just soar for that ultimate climax. It is fucking operatic, like chills up the neck and back, tears, the whole thing. Like, so many movies fail to follow the example provided by Thelma and Louise, where you got to send the audience out of the theater on a high note, a scene of incredible emotional power where they're going to talk about it the rest of the night. They're going to go out to dinner and they're going to talk about it with their friends. They're going to recommend it to all their friends. It's just fucking astonishing how emotionally impactful that climax is. But the movie's also hilarious. Like, a lot of people love to be offended by this movie, but I think they're overlooking just how funny some of the offensive stereotypes are. Like Shooter McGavin, aka Christopher McDonald, he's so goddamn funny in this. It makes me like fall out of my chair. Like, his wife's trying to explain to something to him on the phone, and he's supposed to be listening, but he's like, hang on, hold on. He's like watching the football game and getting all pissed off. And
Hold on.
This camera, we gassing him, boy.
Oh, come on, Kirk. Pick it.
Kirk gets him, knocks the ball loose. Chad Rowland's got it. Kirk's got it. We end up with a...
Talking to the cops, and he's like, I guess I'm in love with her as much as you can be with a nutcase like that. Like, he is, anyway, he makes me absolutely howl. And we also have Brad Pitt on the cusp of superstardom, still skinny, not yet king of the abs like he would turn into with Fight Club and Snatch. But Brad Pitt, he's incredible in this. But I think these are the best roles of Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis's career. They've never been better. And I grew up watching Gina. Actually, maybe I prefer Gina Davis in The Fly. But for Susan Sarandon, nothing else comes close. And you could maybe get into the weeds and say how like Harvey Keitel, his accent doesn't sound authentic enough in comparison to Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon. But he's such like a noble, like wholesome influence over the movie that we can forgive Harvey Keitel struggling with the accent. I mean, we had that great Hans Zimmer score, but this is just a stylish movie. It's an exciting movie. It's a dramatic movie. It's so intense. I think this is a movie that is going to withstand the test of time for many more decades to come. And if you've never seen Thelma Louise, you are in for a treat, but it's time to transition into the top 5 movies of Ridley Scott's career. And what better place to start than with Black Rain from 1989, a movie which put Ridley Scott's career back on track. It was a nice, fat, juicy commercial success. And I did not see it in the theater, much to my shame and horror. I just overlooked it at age 13. But as soon as it came on HBO, I was like, this is right up my alley. And it's funny how Michael Douglas, you don't think of him as like an action hero, but after Romancing the Stone, for a brief shining moment, he had kind of like some action credentials. But, you know, you put him on a motorcycle and give him a shotgun, and he looks pretty cool. And this is just a classic kind of fish out of water scenario where you have a corrupt, dirty New York cop who's, you know, tough-talking guy and likes to take shortcuts and likes to get things done, and he's got a more noble partner played by Andy Garcia. But they're escorting a criminal back to Japan, and whereupon he escapes through a great act of subterfuge, and Michael Douglas decides he's not leaving Japan until this guy's captured again. And so you have like what feels like a New York kind of cop thriller, but set in Tokyo. And if you were to ask, ask anybody in 1989, who is the best filmmaker alive to capture the neon lights of Tokyo and just the way this environment looks, Jesus Christ, there's no one better alive than Ridley Scott to capture that. I mean, it's like you look at Blade Runner, like, all right, that's a made-up science fiction universe. Black Rain looks just as good, just as interesting. It's just chocolate for the eyes. But you got a Hans Zimmer score, you got Kate Capshaw looking hot as hell. But the absolute masterstroke of this movie is the casting, both with one of the heroes as well as with the villain, because you could only pick these actors if you really know your Japanese cinema, because you've got Ken Takakura, and he had done shitloads of Japanese kind of like cop thrillers in the 60s and 70s. A lot of American audiences had already seen him in the Yakuza, where he acted opposite Robert Mitchum back in the 70s. But he has this incredible sense of honor and dignity which he brings to the movie. And at the time of this movie's release, he was one of the biggest movie stars in all of Japan. Like, it was really hard to even shoot in Japan. It's hard to shoot in Japan, period, because there's a kind of a complex bureaucracy that you have to navigate. But also, like, hordes of fans would show up to the location just to see him in action, which made it very difficult. But his bonding scenes with Andy Garcia, like with the exchange of gifts and the tie and singing karaoke together, and then seeing his slow but inevitable bonding scene with Michael Douglas's character. Even though he frowns upon Michael Douglas, thinks he's unethical, he's dishonest, he brings shame on himself and he brings shame on his partner. But by the end of the movie, seeing the kind of the redemption arc, it's incredibly moving stuff. But you also have actor Yusaku Matsuda, who I must admit I didn't appreciate at the time, but now I'm starting to appreciate. Sadly, he died of bladder cancer shortly after shooting this movie, and he knew making this movie would make him sick or sicker and like hasten his own demise. But the movie is dedicated to his memory. And he said if he did this movie with Ridley, he knew he would live forever. But his place in the Movie Lover Hall of Fame was already assured due to a trilogy, which I just discovered recently, called the Game Trilogy from the late 70s. And if you're not familiar with the poster art of Tony Stella, definitely check out Tony Stella's art for the Game re-release on Blu-ray. And check out Tony Stella's poster for Black Rain, a movie which I know Tony is a fan of. But what's cool about Yusaku Matsuda's kind of screen persona, he's that ultimate I don't give a fuck persona that you could ever hope to find in movies, where he's kind of sneering and insolent and disrespectful, but at the same time, a complete and total bad motherfucker. And he's brilliant as the villain in this. The way he puts his fingers together and points them at Michael Douglas, but Michael Douglas doesn't even understand what's happening, but it's because his character is about to make an escape. And goddamn, if you're going to have a villain in the movie, like, let him do villainous shit. Like, I love seeing him walk into a restaurant in New York, confronting the Yakuza, meeting with the Italian mafia, and he just starts stabbing and killing people and acting like a maniac. It's like, maybe don't kill a bunch of people in a crowded restaurant surrounded by cops and gangsters and that sort of thing, but he just does not give a fuck, and he's just absolutely incredible. So if you like watching hybrid movies where Hollywood cinema and Japanese cinema collide, this might be the best example of that in history. And for my number 4, let's talk Gladiator, a movie which I've always liked and respected, but I rewatched it the other night. I may or may not have taken a little gummy or an edible to kind of enhance the experience. And goddamn, after revisiting the movie, it climbed the ranks pretty aggressively. I don't know where I would have ranked it if I hadn't revisited it, but I did. And I think it's a really special movie. And it had kind of a troubled production. And it sucks when you lose an actor like Oliver Reed and he dies during the making of the movie. And I heard some story. I can't remember if I read this or if I heard this from the crew. But apparently in the days leading up to his death, he was still going out on his nightly bar crawls. And he was like challenging onshore fishermen or sailors to like arm wrestling matches. I mean, he's just such a goddamn maniac. But this was the second highest grossing movie of 2000 behind Mission Impossible 2. Just incredible. People don't even like Mission Impossible 2. I kind of like it. It's a John Woo movie, but that was the highest grossing movie of that year. But I can vividly recall my first impression of this movie. I was in the theater sometime in 1999. The trailer started, and it started playing the score from Conan the Barbarian by Basil Pelodorus, one of the greatest scores ever written by a human being. I was like, wait a second. I was like, I recognize this music. And they showed Russell Crowe, walking out and like fighting that fucking fighting the badass was Sven Ole Thorsen, who was also in Conan the Barbarian. It was like tigers are leaping on his back. I was like, this is going to be something special. And I think what separates this from so many other epics is that it has that pulse that if you don't have that pulse, the epic just feels like history under glass. You need great dramatic scenes with great dramatic dialogue in order to make your historical epic feel like grand opera, to feel like a true epic, instead of just kind of like I said, a joyless, soulless experience like so many other epics end up becoming. Just little lines like when Maximus tells his soldiers, what we do in life echoes in eternity. And he doesn't try to oversell the line. He just lets the dialogue speak for itself. And the cast in this is incredible. Like Richard Harris is really good. Joaquin Phoenix is amazing. Connie Nielsen, I mean, good God. Like if you want to talk about movies where they're leaning into the whole incest is best thing, this movie's got you covered. Jimon Hansu is really good. But getting back to the whole thing about having like the pulse or the beating heart at the core of your epic, you need scenes like when Derek Jacobi's character is talking about how the sand of the Colosseum is the heartbeat of Rome, and that the emperor, the new emperor, is going to bring the Roman citizens death, and they'll love him for it. And Derek Jacobi, he's been doing great work for a long, long time. Actually, I used to have an audiobook of the Iliad read by Derek Jacobi. He knows how to sell epics and mythology and just like kind of that larger-than-life storytelling. And you have this incredibly stirring score by Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerard. Great photography by John Matheson. It's a stirring movie. And if you aren't stirring emotionally, your epic will fall flat. And I like how all the different battles throughout the movie, they all feel unique and totally necessary to the story. Like one of my favorites is when Russell Crowe comes out in that smaller Coliseum, beats the crap out of like 6 or 7 people, hurls a sword into the audience, and just says, that scene establishes something about his character. But then it gets much more interesting when he gets to Rome and he becomes a leader of men, and basically a bunch of guys who are supposed to just be slaughtered by people in chariots, they end up kicking their ass. But even then, after that battle, they slow down and they give Russell Crowe some great dialogue. You need that writing. When he takes his helmet off and he says, my name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions, and loyal servant to the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. I can't even act, and I'm giving myself chills even remembering that scene. And I think Russell Crowe won a goddamn Oscar for this. It got nominated for a bunch of Oscars. Let's see if I've got it written down. Yeah, it won Best Picture and it won Best Actor for Crowe, and well deserved. So before I move on, I just want to give credit where credit is due. David Franzoni, John Logan, and William Nicholson, they did an amazing job writing this thing. And I think what's best of all is seeing how there's this classic painting, which in English is translated to Thumbs Down, by Jean-Léon Gérôme. But this 19th century painting, just the look and flavor of that painting inspired the overall look and flavor of this movie. And it just how Ridley Scott, he recognizes a great painting when he sees one. He is a visual artist, and he just took that painting and he just channeled it right into this movie. But at last we come to my top 3, and I feel like I've got just enough of my voice and my enthusiasm left for some Iron Man film commentary. So let's start with Ridley Scott's debut feature film, The Duellists from 1977. And he'd already directed a lot of commercials, a few shorts, a few episodes of television. But goddamn, you want to talk about strong directorial debuts when it comes to features. I mean, there are a lot of great debuts out there. You can talk about Terrence Malick with Badlands, or Orson Welles with Citizen Kane, or David Lynch with Eraserhead, or the Coen brothers with Blood Simple. There are a lot of great debuts out there. Speaking of which, I should do a top 10 directorial debut video, and I'm going to write that down right now before I forget. But getting back to The Duellists, holy shit, I don't have any notes written down about this movie because I saw it when I was doing a podcast about Harvey Keitel's career like a year or so ago. I revisited the movie and I was just completely, totally enthralled. But it tackles a very similar period to Napoleon. It's the Napoleonic Wars. But you basically have two guys where over the course of several years and several military campaigns find themselves dueling over and over and over again because Harvey Keitel's character, he just can't let it go. He's a man of honor, maybe misguided honor, but he feels like he's been offended, he's been slighted, and he must get revenge. And Keith Carradine's just like, you sick fuck, just relax, let it go. And it's just hilarious watching Keith Carradine's exasperation with this savage who just is hell-bent upon fighting him with blade or with revolver, or I don't even know how you describe those old-fashioned early 1800 pistols. But what's cool about the movie is how over the course of the film, every time they duel, the setting changes and the weapons change. Like the first time, it's the good old-fashioned classic duel, the way you would want to see it with the two rapiers, but they also duel on horseback. They deal with pistols at the end of the movie. It's fucking awesome. And they're even forced to kind of fight side by side at one point in one particular battle. But goddamn, the look of this movie, the pacing of this movie, just the mood, the style, the atmosphere. I feel like that's something that's so lost these days with so many movies where they're so preoccupied with so many other concerns and they forget style is everything. Maybe it can be empty at times, but if you don't have style, you don't even have movies. And so I feel like when it comes to music, photography, editing, all the tools that filmmakers have at their fingertips, you can't ask for better than The Duellists, and the actors were game. I love The Duellists, and I feel like it kind of gets overshadowed by Alien and Blade Runner, which I get because I like those movies quite a bit. I'm about to get to them, but if you've only seen Blade Runner, Alien, and some of his later movies, go back to the beginning and give credit where credit is due and watch The Duellists. And now we come to Blade Runner from 1982, a movie which I first saw as the original director's cut in the early 90s while studying abroad in Spain. I think it was the summer of 93, but the director's cut was still floating around. So I saw it in Madrid in English, but with Spanish subtitles. And I can remember how as I was watching, I was like, wait a second, what's going on here? Because I remembered certain scenes. I'd seen a few moments here and there on HBO scattered throughout the 80s, but I never quite knew what Blade Runner was as a child. I mean, obviously, I knew what Indiana Jones was, and I knew what fucking Star Wars was. So I was familiar with Harrison Ford, but Blade Runner just completely, totally vanished. And I was 6 when it came out. I just wasn't in a position to appreciate, futuristic neo-noir in a sci-fi setting. But, I mean, what can you say about Blade Runner that has not been said before? It's a goddamn science fiction masterpiece. It's up there with 2001. It's up there with Metropolis. It's up there with any science fiction film you care to mention. It's up there with Alien, which we'll be getting to in a few short seconds. But when it comes to the photographic style, the music, just the eerie spell it can cast over a crowd. I can remember my junior year in college during the Virginia Film Festival. They played the director's cut at 10 in the morning on a Sunday, and a few of my friends and I went in. We were baked as hell. We showed up, sat down, just trying not to talk to anybody, and the movie started, and you could have heard a pin drop at any point throughout the running time of the movie. I very rarely have I seen a movie that just completely picks up an audience and takes them on a journey where people, pre-cell phones, everybody's just transfixed by this experience. And for all you fuckheads out there that like turning on phones during a movie, that is the spell you are destroying when you check Twitter to see who's making fun of your most recent post. When a little light blinks on in a corner, instead of being absorbed by what you're seeing, for a few seconds, the audience is going to look at you. and that ruins it. And a great movie-going experience is a great movie-going experience that's shared by everybody, and the moment you turn on your phone is ruined. So that's another topic for another day. But Blade Runner, I love it. Maybe the final cut is my favorite version now, but I mean, everything with Rutger Hauer's character and his journey and his philosophical observations about his own finite lifespan and the idea of a candle burning twice as bright, burning only half as long, and as his creator tells him, and how brightly you've burned. Astonishing. Sean Young, so goddamn beautiful. I mean, everything about this movie, it works, except for perhaps the pacing. Don't watch it when you're tired, because you will fall asleep. But let's move on to my number one, Alien, 1979. Now, I can't be quite sure when I saw this movie because we're dealing with memories from a long time ago, but I believe I'd seen Aliens on HBO, been floored. And then my dad was like, oh, well, like, hold my beer. And so we watched Alien on VHS, and it delivered. It's got some of the best scenes in movie history, irrespective of the genre. It's got astonishing casting. I mean, the cast, Jesus Christ. I mean, just the cast alone. You could do a 2-hour video just about how good the cast is in Alien, and the script and the atmosphere and the ideas. And I think this is one of like the textbook examples of like teasing just enough information where your imagination just expands and grows, trying to fill in the gaps on that world. Like when you see on the ship, that giant area with all those eggs. That's the reason Prometheus was made. It's like, why is there a ship with a bunch of alien eggs like crash on this planet? Like who created that? Who created that ship? Why were they taking all those eggs? So on and so forth. And there's that point where John Hurt, he looks around and he screams and exclaims as he sees just this giant vision in front of him. But it's just a few brief seconds, and it's one of those things that gets people talking about it for years on end. When you see the style of the ship and the different stages of the xenomorph's lifespan, all based on the art of H.R. Giger, I mean, goddamn, like, are there Giegers out there today that can be used or employed by the movie industry to inspire more movies? Obviously, he was first discovered and kind of roped in to do Jodorowsky's Dune, and I love that bit in Jodorowsky's Dune. It's like, your art is a very dark art. Like, that's the reason why he was hired to create the look in the field, the Harkonnens, for the movie that was never shot. But goddamn, I don't know if there's ever been a better situation where the art and style of a designer was then translated into movies. And Ridley was so hands-on with this. Like even little things, like when you see the facehugger moving down in its little pod, it's Ridley's fingers himself bringing it to life before it leaps out and jumps on the face of John Hurt's character. And so much about this movie works so goddamn well, but just it's the cast. In the end, if it ain't on the page, it ain't on the stage. You need great actors and great writing. And Ian Holm, Veronica Cartwright, fucking Yaphet Kotto, Harry Dean Stanton, John Hurt, Tom Skerritt, and Sigourney Weaver. It's all killer, no filler. Every single one of the actors in the movie is like one of the best actors that you've ever seen in any genre, in any period. And they just come together, creating that incredible sense of camaraderie and authenticity when they're sitting around having that meal right before John Hurt's chest is going to get torn open. The horror on the faces of the actors, it's so genuine and so real. When Veronica Cartwright screams as the blood splatters, it's so real.
Oh, God.
I don't know to what degree the stories have been exaggerated, that the actors didn't quite know what was going to happen in that scene, but they fucking sell it. And I also believe that Ripley on the page her gender was never, it was either never specified or the character was written as a man. And you want to talk about strong female characters on screen. I hate even saying strong female character because now that's associated with so many terrible characters and so many terrible shows and movies. She's just a great character, irrespective of her genre, of her gender. And I think that's what is lost in so many movies that are trying to do the girl boss characters. Don't try to make them a girl boss character. Just make her authentic, make her interesting, make her cool. And the power that she will exude will come naturally. And Sigourney Weaver, I've had a crush on her my entire life, ever since I saw Ghostbusters. But this is a strong contender for the best movie of her career. But she's had a lot of great movies to her name. But I think at this point, I'm starting to ramble. I can feel my words not even like coming together as I try to form them in my brain. and I still need to edit this thing, so it's time to wrap up this video. I just checked my total time recorded for this video prior to starting editing, and I've got an hour and 38 minutes of footage that needs to be condensed, and a lot of that's just me stumbling or stuttering and rambling and smacking my face and just babbling like an idiot. I don't know how long this video is going to be when I'm finished, but it has been a pleasure and a privilege sharing my love and affection for Ridley Scott's career. And if people like this video, there's some other filmmakers with upcoming movies where I might give them similar treatment. Like Michael Mann before Ferrari, I could easily do this. He's only got like 12 movies, so it's much easier. Hayao Miyazaki's got an upcoming movie. Denis Villeneuve's got an upcoming movie. So for all these directors, I might have to do career retrospective videos if people like this. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Let me know what you think I got wrong or what I overlooked. Obviously, I couldn't do the deep dive in all these movies and include all the information that's available, but I didn't want to just regurgitate all the information from IMDb trivia. I wanted to make it more personal, but I'm tired and I got to edit this fucker, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, but I hope everybody has a great week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.